Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Artenders with Mac and Dan. I am Dan, and we do this, we try to keep a weekly podcast where we review pieces of art that we want to look at, discuss, and sort of take in what they're doing. And so this one was a long time coming. So we have done the 3 seasons of Avatar, each individual episodes, to ramp me up into watching The Legend of Korra, another TV show that appeared on Nickelodeon and was a sequel to the series The Avatar: The Last Airbender. And the big reason why we're doing this sort of setup and now we're doing Korra is because I don't want to speak out of turn here, but Mac, what are your just very base thoughts on Korra?
Sure. So the reason that we started watching Avatar in the first place is because I wanted to get Danny and Emma to come to come and talk together, so that we can all bash it together. Just absolutely roast the living hell out of it.
And to explain who Emma is Mac's girlfriend, and she is actually joining us on this episode, our very first guest.
Absolutely. Say hi, Emma.
Hey, guys.
And Emma, what are your, just very quickly before we get into the nitty-gritty and the details, what are your immediate first thoughts on The Legend of Korra?
Okay, well, I did write down some notes, and the notes are titled The Legend of Korra is Garbage. So there's that. That kind of sums it up.
All right. So usually for these podcast episodes, I come in with notes. For this one, I didn't come in with any notes. And there's a specific reason why. And it's because, so these two individuals, I am getting tag teamed here. And because they do not care for this show, as you just heard, but I actually, upon first viewing, thoroughly enjoyed it.
Mm-hmm. Now, to clear things up, Emma does dislike it quite a bit more than me. That does not mean that I like it. I would definitely say that I do not like it, but that's not to say that I absolutely, vividly hate it. I just don't necessarily like it.
So I in my mind, kind of how I see this shtick going today, is me. Have you seen that image of it's a sort of drawing, it's a painting of sorts, and it's like a meme essentially, and it's the army soldier, right, taking in all the bullets and all the shrapnel and protecting like the little kid in the bed?
That's terrifying.
So I am the soldier.
Oh my gosh.
And then Korra's the kid in the bed.
That's not the truth,
Danny,
bro.
no.
To say really fast, I really enjoyed Korra, and we'll get into more detail.
Can I tell you why that specific image bothers me?
Why?
Because implying that Korra is the little kid implies that Korra has any sort of life to it whatsoever, and it does not.
And I think this is wholly unfair. But, Emma, you have a list, is that correct, of things you did not like about The Legend of Korra?
Yes, absolutely. Well, kind of going off of what Max said right there, I also don't think that it's fair to label Korra as like anything that needs protecting, seeing as she has no positive qualities.
Ooh, I like that starting point. I am
not going to object currently. I am going to hear, I am going to listen, and I am going to intake. Because clearly I disagree. But I want to give the possibility of me being wrong. So please, Emma, let's just start with one thing. What was one thing in particular that just peeved you about the show?
Yeah, so Korra herself as a protagonist, I didn't find her as a super likable protagonist. I felt like she didn't have to change very much. A lot of things were just handed to her. And since we're following her on her journey to becoming the Avatar, then you kind of expect some kind of arc or growth. But it seems like she just kind of like ran head first into everything, and then things just worked out in the end.
Kind of along that same line, it really bothered me. I think like one of the pinnacle things that set the show on an awful track is that in the very first episode, they show that like as a child, like before, like as a toddler, right? She already has 3 of the 4 elements mastered. One that breaks plenty of rules about the show. No Avatar has ever done that before. That's kind of strange. And also, it's like now it's just a matter of like you figure out how to do air and then what? like there's, just like Emma was saying, there's not really anything to build off of after that.
So, to begin, there's a lot to tackle.
Thank you for waiting. I'm shocked. I can feel the heat radiating off your body.
Oh, because immediately I was like, there's so many things I could just hate right now, right here, right then. So the thing is that I at first thought the same thing. I was confused as to why would they immediately start this show with Korra already mastering, but at the very least, she has 3 of the 4 elements, right? That's a very distinct approach. Eventually, I was sort of putting the pieces together, right? So the last element that she didn't have was air, and it made me have the sort of realization that, oh, that's right. We have already seen 3 seasons of somebody learning water, learning earth, learning fire. One of the big things that I appreciate a lot about Korra is how much it's trying to do its own thing and how much it's not trying to be like Airbender. So we have from the beginning of something very, very different, right? We don't necessarily have someone becoming the Avatar and getting into that role, right? We had Aang, who at the very beginning, like from the show, trying to run away from the responsibilities of being an Avatar until the very end he confronts it and becomes a successful Avatar, right? And then we see it in the very first episode of Korra, that Korra wants to be the Avatar immediately. She wants those responsibilities. So that show is a little bit less about becoming the Avatar, and it's more about how do I approach this as the Avatar? Like, I already have that responsibility, and I think I have the necessary tools to fulfill that responsibility. Also, to just go right back to Korra learning the other elements, like I said, we have already seen a character learn water, earth, fire, and I appreciate the show. Just the first thing it's doing was just getting that out of the way and then focusing on a character learning air, which is not something that we've seen, period. Also, just a quick rebuttal that we don't know how previous avatars learned their elements. We saw Aang and we saw Roku, how they learned their elements. But how do we know how so many generations of avatars partook their journey?
And also won.
And also Avatar 1. Yes, thank you.
Just really quick, an image that popped into my head is that whenever Korra is learning how to airbend, the first thing she does, the very first thing, is she cheats in a race against children much younger than her, using her airbending powers on those little, like, wind balls or whatever. I think she, like, cheats against Jinora, and I forget the other 2 little ones.
That is correct. She cheats against Jinora, Iki, and Milo.
There we go.
The 3 wonderful children, the grandchildren of Avatar Aang.
Who I think any of them would be a more likable protagonist than Korra. Also, like, Asami, a very likable protagonist. Honestly, like, Bolin, a likable protagonist. But Korra, I just was like,
So your problems with Korra, the character, stems from the sort of journey that she takes, and you feel that she does not take a proper character journey. You did not feel, let me make sure I'm getting this right, that you did not feel that she changed from a character, for the most part, from the very first episode to the very end.
Yes. Or even whenever she tried to change, everything just kind of fell into place.
Yes.
Also, something.
So she didn't really had to go through any hardship. And a built-in hardship with the avatars learning the elements, and she didn't have to do that.
Yeah, well, and also I watched a video on this, and they were talking about how most of the time the avatar's journey, they're learning other skills and tools besides just the elements, because they have to study with different masters and they go to a lot of different places. But in Korra's case, they just, I think is it the White Lotus? The Red Lotus?
The White Lotus,
the
yes,
White
is the
Lotus.
organization, yeah.
Yeah, they just came and they trained her. So she didn't have to learn skills like responsibility or how to communicate with others. She literally was just like trained for combat, like as a weapon. And
so we have already seen the show of somebody learning the elements, and that was a large part of their hardship. Now, I know you're saying that is a qualm that you have with this current show, but I can tell you relatively confidently, not necessarily, I don't think, and I'm basically putting words in your mouth, and I understand that, but I've gone down this path, so I have to keep going.
Yeah, go.
That you do not want to watch that show again in a different manner, because you've already seen that show. And so if Korra tried to be more like Avatar in its execution, it would have failed, I think, even more. Because I think there's nothing that Korra, the show, could have done that Avatar also did, and that Korra could have done a better job at that. So Korra immediately from the beginning sets out to do a very different thing.
Yeah, and I'm saying that they didn't have to. Not specifically with the Avatar stuff necessarily, but I mean in general, the Avatar: The Last Airbender as a prequel series, already set up so much, and I mean really assisted Legend of Korra in that it gave it such an awesome world to jump into.
I agree.
And Korra took a shit on that world before it even started.
Oh, okay. So hold on. We gotta take it one thing at a time. Go ahead,
Stress,
Emma.
I love it.
I was just going to say, I don't have a problem with the book structure. Like, I don't have a problem with how they go from, like, air to spirits. I don't remember what the other two were. But, like, my problem is just with her. Like, I don't like her character traits. I don't find her super likable. And I don't feel like that changes by the end.
I think, so... Sorry, I just took a big old pause and there was just nothing there. I apologize for that.
No.
But
it's a good old thinking pause. It's one of those thinking pauses.
So that's actually, so far, I just want to say that all the things that Mac has been saying, I have not cared for. I'm sitting right next to him, right? I have been wholeheartedly disagreeing with everything that he's been saying, but to a degree, I agree with what you are saying, Emma.
Thank you.
That I don't have that same big of a problem as Korra. I still feel as though she does change as a character, but those changes aren't as obvious, and they should be obvious, right? And sort of, so you were mentioning earlier as well how avatars would learn like about responsibility and stuff through their teachings, right? And what I appreciate about this show is that Korra also learned about these responsibilities, but they weren't through teaching, they were through practice, and they were through confronting these foes. And like I said, I do think Korra changes as a character, but it's definitely not as obvious and not as, it feels like big of a change compared to Aang essentially growing up, right? Where we have this character in Korra, like because for me, once you actually start to look at the little things and you're like, okay, no, Korra has grown and she has matured, and definitely originally at the beginning, everything is headstrong and head first. And I agree that things just kind of fall into her lap and it just works out in the end mostly because of like the amount of support that she has around her. But yes, I see where you're coming from. But Mac, you were saying just now how Korra takes a big ol' crap on the world that is set up by the original show. Can you please go into further detail?
Okay, so right off the bat, what is the biggest difference between Korra, like in the first few seconds of the show, the biggest difference between Korra and the world that Avatar: The Last Airbender created?
I think it's basically this world's version of the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah, absolutely. So why does that need to happen?
So I understand where you're coming from. I think also it would have not made sense if it didn't happen. So let me go into detail.
I would like that. I would like that a lot.
Because so in the first season, we still see some industrial things happen, right? But they're not as frequent, right? We still see some factories. We see a bunch of tanks, and we see the drill going into Ba Sing Se, right? But what's it's sort of through line between all those things is that they're all controlled by the Fire Nation, right? So the Fire Nation has control of all of these technological advancements. Once the Fire Nation has been essentially freed and Zuko has helped alleviate those sort of borders, let's say, of course, the spread of technology is going to happen. And in a world where you can so easily just create buildings because of a bunch of earthbenders, and do things a lot more easily when resources is just your own corpus. Of course, there's going to be this sort of technological revolution where the world is going to progress like crazy. So I was also a little bit jarred at the very beginning of the show, like, oh man, we're in the 1920s. Oh, there are cars. Oh, there are just these things happening. And it's not just like that sort of thing, but it's also the clothing that people wear.
Yeah.
And sort of like a lot of the customs have changed, right? The sort of like the only things that stayed true to how they were the 70 years ago where Airbender was set was like small villages and Air Temple Island and how Tenzin and his crew do traditions, right?
Yeah.
So those were the only things that were really constant. But I'm happy that they took this bold approach, and it's going to be the same thing. And I imagine I'm going to keep repeating myself that Korra tries to do something that Avatar didn't, right? So it makes sense that this world has progressed 70 years later. And so we're going to see a lot of this new version of this world. And we have already seen Airbender be set in this one world, and it's nice to have a sequel where even though it's familiar, it's also completely different. Emma, you have something to say.
Really quick, I don't know if this bothered either of you, but I don't understand how we went from one Appa to an entire population of sky bison 70 years later. How did they repopulate? I don't understand.
Skyson.
That is a question, and that is a question I still have, and that is a question I'll always have. And I can have that as one of the sort of ticks against Korra, because so I will say, I will be candid. One of my biggest things about Korra is how it wanted to sometimes just over-explain everything and remove the mystery on some things. So with the big thing that I'm alluding to is the origin of the Avatar and how the first Avatar started, right? So did we need that? No, I didn't mind the execution of the sort of origin story of the first Avatar and Avatar 1, because I thought like also the art style in those couple of episodes was somehow distinctly unique from the rest of the show, as well as just where the show was going from there. I thought it was interesting, but like I said, we didn't need it. And so what it does is this sort of thing that I like to call the mystery box, right? There's a TED Talk by J.J. Abrams a few years ago, and what he talks about is that sometimes you have this mystery box, right? And the sort of mystery of it, of whatever is in that box, makes it super duper interesting. But sometimes when you open that box, it's not going to be cool as the mystery originally was. And I think that was one of the biggest drawbacks. So I didn't mind the second season where this happens, taking the direction of putting more of a focus on the spirit world and having a completely different problem that Aang had to deal with in the original show. Like, he dealt with the spirit world a little bit, but not to this scale, right? But I think season 2 in particular was drawn back by this sort of world-ending thing that's related to the very first Avatar, right? Things like that I do believe that it held back the show. But once again, I want to make sure that I am heard, that I appreciate that Korra tries to do very different things. And if you don't feel that those things are good on their own, that's fine. But I appreciate them sticking their neck out to do something completely different, because we've already seen that show. And if they try to make another Avatar itself, it would have not been successful.
I agree with that, by the way. I think that I agree with that sentiment. Sorry.
Yeah, definitely. Two things that I was just thinking about right then. I think another inconsistency that's kind of difficult to overcome is the fact that the avatar state means little to nothing in Legend of Korra. Like,
That's fair.
it basically just gives her the amount of power that she needs to kind of be on the same level as her enemy. So she brings it out in almost every fight, and that was a little bothersome. But also, because we were talking about how we had those origin episodes that kind of broke up the formula for this season, I found that that's another problem that I had with Korra was in Avatar Last Airbender. Each episode was kind of contained within itself, where you would have a story every episode, but it was building towards something larger. Whereas with Korra, the formula seemed to be a full season. So I feel like we had a lot of like mush or a lot of filler until like the last 4 episodes of every season, and then it would get good. And then a lot of plot would be involved.
And I would actually, personally, I would shorten that to 2, the last 2 episodes of each season.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Wow.
May I go into that, or do you want to go?
I've been talking a lot. Why don't you go into that?
Okay, sure. So, yeah, I think kind of going off with what Emma said, I think that the Avatar: The Last Airbender did a not perfect, but a fantastic job at finding a marriage between the idea of 3-act structure and serialized television, because it was kind of in that like in between section of TV history, where it kind of had to be both at the same time. And so it was really good at there's a 3-act structure I mean like there were 3 seasons and 3 extra acts within each season, within each episode, and all that good stuff, as well as, like Emma was saying, it stayed true to serialized television by having the war be its frame, that like there was always the war in the background, and there was a super objective for the series. There's not really one for Legend of Korra for all 3 seasons. Each season...
4.
Sorry, I'm so sorry.
Get those facts straight.
I know, I'm so sorry.
There's not a through line for the 4 seasons, yeah.
Yeah, like each season like happens on its own. And I think the problem with that is that because each episode is stuck within whatever format they decided that season was going to be. And because like with Avatar, if they have a bad episode, the next episode's going to be an entirely different story in a new place with new characters. Whereas with Korra, whenever you have a bad episode, it's like
they're stuck in that plot.
That shit's going to carry to the next episode, and it's going to take you a few episodes before you can bounce back from that, because you're stuck in whatever story you've made for yourself.
And you got to tie that, at least in some way.
Right.
I understand where that sentiment is coming from 100%. That I think this sort of narrative structure where each episode doesn't necessarily have its own plot and each season is its own story, essentially, is, I think, both one of Korra's biggest strengths and also one of Korra's biggest weaknesses.
I agree with that, yeah.
Because so what this does, right, is that it presents a new each season having its own villain, essentially. It presents Korra with a new thing to tackle each time, right? That's like each thing is a very big deal, right? So I never really felt like the stakes were low for one individual villain over the other, right? I felt that the stakes were high for Amon. I felt that they were high for Vaatu and Unalaq, for Zahir, and for Kuvira at the end, all in their own unique ways. But I agree with what you say, right? That if like an episode finds itself in this poor plot, it's going to take a minute to get itself out. And so, but I think for me also, this allows for the dramatic storytelling to be more rewarding because you're getting more of this arc throughout an individual season.
It did fix the one problem we were talking about with Avatar. That kept going, yeah.
Yes, which was the pacing, right? Am I speaking out of turn here?
Yeah, the pacing, and that they give enough time to each story.
Yeah. Emma, you have some thoughts?
Yeah, I was going to say, that is one of the positives for Korra, for me, is the villain structure, how they're actually just people that have different sets of ethics and ideals instead of being like, haha, a bad guy. They're each different, and they're just showing, like, I think it was season 3 that they kind of went to, like, a communist background.
Basically, Amon. Yes. No. So Amon was the equalist in the first season.
Yes, you're right.
Then we had Unalaq. Yes, we'll get there. So then we had Unalaq, which was the head of the Northern Water Tribe in the second season. Yes, the brother of Korra's father. And he basically united forces with the it's kind of silly, but like the Dark Spirits.
Yeah, right.
I really fast. I think season 2 is the weakest season.
I was about to ask what you thought was the worst and best.
It's season 2 is the worst. I think season 3 is the best. Season 3 had Zahir, and Zahir was a part of the Red Lotus, which was the opposite of the White Lotus, and the Red Lotus wanted essentially disorder, and that was their order. Like there's something in anarchy. Like anarchy is the way to live life, essentially. And then we had the 4th season, which was Kuvira, which was the Great Uniter, which was basically a conqueror. And what I liked so much about these villains, and there was a little bit that Toph in season 4 talked about, was that each villain's ideals weren't necessarily bad. Amon wanted non-benders to be equal in some capacity. Unalaq wanted a unification of the spirit world and the actual physical world. Zahir wanted people not to be bound in chains to a degree, right, by governments and such. And then we had Kuvira trying to unite a country together. And how those 4 individuals go about those issues is completely radical, right? But offer so much more interesting character than Fire Lord Ozai. So I appreciate this show going into the sort of villains where they're just fundamentally more interesting characters. So we're also drawn to not only the main crew, but as well as like how the villains succeed. Did you have a thought, Emma? Was I just wholly wrong?
I can have one, but yeah. So I think that the villains are way more appealing. I think that one of the things that was hard for me with this show was that love triangle. That just does anyone break up with anyone? Because I don't think they do. They just like move on to dating someone else.
Some unspoken agreement that it's like we're not seeing each other anymore, and I'm just gonna go over here.
Yes. But we're a little bit on time. I just occurred. I was so enthralled by this conversation.
No, it's
but
good, though.
When we come back from our break, the first thing we'll discuss is this love triangle.
All right, if you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Now, just let me explain. First of all, it's free. Second of all, Anchor will distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and a whole bunch more. And third, now this is really important, you can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. Hear me when I say no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. Howdy, folks, and welcome back to the Artenders with Mac and Dan. We have Emma here as well. We left off last segment.
There we go.
Last segment on the love triangle. The love triangle. I hate you. Okay, the love triangle between, oh gosh, we have...
How can you forget their names?
Korra, we have...
Mako, and we have Asami.
We have Mako, right. And Asami, as I'm sure Emma's about to say, is not objectively, but a little cooler than Korra.
Well, yeah, also she's like freaking hot. She's
there
cool.
Is that.
We are not here to judge.
Okay, but I don't even mean that in like a physical way.
Here?
I do, but I also mean in like a cool way.
Asami is cool.
Like she's a badass. Yeah. She like runs the company. She like took it in stride that her dad was evil and like just kept going, you know?
I never knew what big dick energy was until I saw Asami.
Wow, hot take.
And then
Asami, no, I'm kidding.
Asami was literally so cool that the last avatar is like, yeah, let's ditch this place. Let's just get out of here. You know what I mean?
True.
Okay.
Can we also get into that too?
Wait, we will. But before we get into the very end of the love triangle, I want to briefly talk about the beginning and the middle of the love triangle. So Emma, you did not like the love triangle? Is that an accurate thing for me to say?
Not at all. Mainly because of the lack of clarity. Like, especially, again, like, remind me if I'm wrong, but Korra loses her memory for a hot sec, And Mako
Yes.
and Asami are dating during that time. And then whenever she comes back and she thinks that she's still dating Mako, like no one corrects her. Mako and Asami just stop dating.
Yeah.
There is no closure. He's just
Everyone's like, yikes,
well-
that's not good. And then nothing happens.
I appreciate the show to a degree. I mean, like, look, I agree. At the very least, like the show kind of like acknowledges it later. So Mako is really awkward around Asami and Korra, and is also has a really awkward conversation with Asami, and later on a really awkward conversation with Korra as well. Not to say though that the execution of the love triangle was good, right? I'm never inherently sort of opposed to love triangles, but I feel like it's also typical for love triangles to not necessarily succeed, and I don't think this show necessarily succeeded with their love triangle, because it's the show's priorities were a little bit confusing, whether or not it really wanted to dip its toes into this triangle or not, and sort of like the show didn't want to confront messed up relationships that could happen in an actual love triangle. So it's just like, yeah, Team Avatar, but I'm totally in love with this guy and you're totally in love with this guy, and for the time, and this guy's in love with both of us and he can't decide, and that's a really poopy thing. Yada yada yada. It's so the execution of it is very frustrating. I'm not opposed to the concept of it, but I am opposed to how the show did it.
Yeah, so kind of like what you're saying, and what we were saying earlier as well, that Avatar was able to get away with stuff like that. There was a couple times where they started things and were like, you know what, yeah, that's actually not going to fly, or that's not interesting enough to keep. And they were able to just get rid of it, but you can't really in Korra.
Because they were able to put things down in Avatar and then pick it up later because of how the narrative structure was for each individual episode. And I think the probably the finest example of that, wow, I just took the weirdest breath intake in my life.
Are you good? Are you good?
I don't know, am I?
You kind of look different. You look like you look changed.
Great. The best example of Avatar being able to essentially drop something and pick it up later was when Aang and Katara kissed at the invasion of the Black Sun.
Yeah.
And Aang brings it up later, right? At the same time, though, if I'm remembering things correctly, their relationship didn't really change in between, though, which was a shame.
Frustrating.
Yes. So I guess that's another case where that was both the Avatar, the Airbenders' aid and detriment.
Yeah.
That how it was able to drop things, but also like it was able to drop things, so it did feel like the writers were like, "Ooh, we were able to get out of that one, weren't we, guys? Ooh, close one. Let's just revisit it 5 episodes later,
Right, like
instead of having to deal with this now."
Right. It's
You know?
nice, like thinking back, you're like, man, I wish I would have gotten that. But in the moment, I wasn't really thinking too hard about it. And
Like
it
they
didn't bother me.
certainly gave themselves like get out of jail free cards in
Yeah.
Airbender, where the narrative approach in Korra didn't allow them to execute that sort of thing.
I think a lot of that has to do with just the fact that it's Nickelodeon. Like, they were able to get away with, like, this is a kid's TV show and, like, mask themselves as that, even though it definitely was not for a lot of it. And Korra, I don't think they really set themselves up to be just a regular kid show.
I agree. I actually, that's a very good segue in the sort of thing that I want to ask next is, and I'll ask Emma this first. Do you think, I think it's safe to say that The Legend of Korra overall is a more mature show than Avatar: The Last Airbender. So, with that, do you think that Korra succeeds in that storytelling? It's not necessarily like the most mature story, but do you think Korra succeeds in having that frame of a story?
I mean, I think that it comes across as more mature, but because of the lack of character development, like exploring things like real relationships or real emotions or like depth of character, those are some of the things that age a series up. And so while the action was maybe more mature and the plot lines were more mature, whereas they took more thought to get through, I think that if you're a child that's then a teen trying to navigate the world and they're looking to Korra to be like their teen show that maybe will help them with that or appeals to them rather than like a kid's show to watch for fun, I don't know that it does that.
Okay. I totally understand that. Mac, did you have something to say?
Yeah, kind of on that. I think that there was a lot of like, there's a lot of like cop outs in terms of the way in which they aged it up. I wish that instead of picking up like having a bunch of different villains that had different like philosophical backgrounds,
They had all had different objectives in
Yeah.
one way or another, for the
which
most
was
part.
cool, but it kind of like they kind of made it out to be a little more complex than it actually was. I wish they maybe would have picked one specific philosophy that was a little more complicated and delved into that rather than I don't know. I think
Like as opposed to like, yeah, so each villain had their own ideal. And I will say, like, I think that's a fair criticism, because I think the best example of them having this very good idea for the sort of objective that a villain has, but then not really following 100% through is Amon.
Yes. There was a lot of ideas and representation in the villains. I feel like the villains were ideas and representation.
And I want to say, like, I think the villain, like every single villain in that show was more interesting than Ozai.
Yeah.
But like Ozai was more of a plot device than a character.
Right.
Like Ozai was more so how it serves Zuko and Aang, as opposed to like these villains are also navigating the world and trying to do their thing.
Yeah. I actually am curious. Emma, where does Azula rank in those villains?
Oh, wow.
In compared to the villains of Korra?
I mean,
Because I know Ozai is kind of a throwaway, but
yeah, I feel like has to be more impressive just because she's a child. She's like 14 and she is like this force of nature.
So yes, I agree in that regard, right? But just looking at the character, right? The sort of character that Azula is and how Azula serves the story and other characters as well in the main group per se. How do you think Azula does? Excuse me. How does Azula do in Airbender in comparison to the other respective villains of Korra? Do you find Azula to be more successful, or well, what are your thoughts?
like as a written character?
As a written character and as a villain, and how she contrasts as well the protagonist of the story.
I feel like Azula is just more pure evil. So kind of how we were talking about the villains in Korra, they're not evil. And like they have people that get behind them outside of the reason of fear, whereas Azula really can only use fear to control. So like I think that their methods are maybe more interesting, because with Azula it's like you're scared of her, so you're going to follow her, and then her friends stop following her whenever they decide they care about something more than they care about the fear they have for her.
Mac, did you think Azula was a better character than all the villains in Korra?
No, I know that sounded
Okay.
like I implied that.
It certainly sounded like. So I was just mentally ready to attack you and have
I know.
fight, be on the microphone, and have Emma commentate.
I do think that Azula was a lot more interesting than you think Azula was. I think that
I'll accept that.
I think that learning about Azula in season 3 of Avatar was actually kind of cool to me, and it was cool to get to know Azula on a personal level in a way that we never really did with any villain in Korra. Well, except for maybe
Amon, I would say, like Amon had like that background. Like we got the story from Amon's brother Tarlok and how Amon was raised under former crime boss Yakone and being essentially groomed to be this killer and Yakone's successor. So like, but that's the only exception to what you were saying. But still, to your point, like, yeah, we don't get as much of a deep-rooted background.
yeah, we don't really get emotional buy-in.
Right.
Just good backstory.
But on the subject of villains, because I feel like we can all agree. Can we all agree, first of all, that season 2 of Korra is with Unalaq and Vatu and all about the spirit world. It is the weakest in its execution. Is that a fair thing for all of us to agree on? Emma?
Yes.
Mac?
I think it is the weakest in its execution. I will agree with that. I think that that was the most interesting subject for me. I liked getting all the backstory.
That's fair.
It was the biggest setup. It has in my opinion, by far the most potential.
Yeah, I think the backstory was good. That doesn't mean the backstory was needed.
Yeah, or executed well.
Yeah. But with that being said, I want to talk about very briefly Kuvira, who is the villain in the 4th season, who was formerly a soldier, let's say a guard for Su Beifong. Forgot her name for a second. For Su Beifong. You see her very occasionally in the 3rd season, right? But you're not supposed to like notice her until the very end of the 3rd season, where it's pretty awkward. But the show awkwardly kind of like points to her, and Kuvira talking to Tonrak, Korra's dad. She's like, "That's no worries. You can call me Kuvira." And then the shot is just on her for like 2 seconds. So it's the most obvious thing that like, oh, next season, this character might be important. Also might be evil, because that's a little bit unsettling. And so it becomes exactly that. But I want to talk about the execution of Kuvira, and I'm going to throw it to you, Emma, in just a moment. That her background is very different compared to the rest of the villains, essentially, where, so we see her be good for a lot of the time, and then essentially become misguided and bad. But do you feel that Kuvira was a one-note villain, or do you think that she served the story well for the, I guess, the ultimate season of The Legend of Korra?
Yeah, I think she served it well. I think that the fact that Bolin became one of her members for a hot sec also aided her, because we have been taught to love and care about Bolin, and that he is like innocent and good. So then whenever he joins her, you think, okay, well, maybe we're supposed to give her the benefit of the doubt. And also I liked seeing her a little bit in season 3, because that was the only time that there was some kind of arc between seasons, even though, like you said, it was very awkward. That ending bit.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
I liked her as a character. What were your immediate thoughts?
I agree with Emma specifically with the Bolin bit. I think that's easily the best thing they could have possibly done with Bolin's character.
Because she felt the most human, too.
Yeah.
Which was, I think, so much to her advantage as a character as well.
Yeah.
That, like, I feel like her arc, in terms of what she was trying to do, was so clear. And, like, I feel like we could rationalize someone getting to her position and becoming a sort of Genghis Khan in this world. I thoroughly enjoyed her fundamentally. I will say the giant mech at the end, all of a sudden, we had some, Gundam going on at the very end of the season with a giant arm cannon. I will say, in terms of technological advancement, that one was, like, a little bit too far. Like, I was fine with the mech suits. Like, I was okay with the mech suits.
Yeah.
But the giant mech that was 25 stories tall, I'm like, this is maybe a little bit absurd.
This is kind of Power Rangers.
It is. It's quite.
It's Power Rangers, yeah.
But I'm going to loop this around, and in the biz, they call this a callback. I hate myself. Okay.
I like the getting close to the thing. It's such a good strategy.
Yes. But so at the very end of the season, Korra has this dialogue moment with Kuvira, and she says how Korra says that Kuvira reminds her of herself, and how Kuvira is so headstrong into action and essentially taking things into her own hands. And I think to kind of respond to the growth of Korra had as a character, I wouldn't say that Korra experienced no growth, but I think that sort of dialogue between the two is fair, and it's true that Kuvira is, or I guess like is very similar to what Korra was. That if you look at earlier parts of the season, you're absolutely correct. Korra does go headstrong into things, and Korra absolutely gets saved by Tenzin and others, right? There's no denying it. But I think how she encounters her problems, especially in the 4th season, is completely different than like the first 2, essentially. So I just want to acknowledge that very briefly. So even though Kuvira and her sort of execution as a villain was, I don't know, for some reason a weird one to me, I think she was like the best one because of how she served the protagonist in some way or form. But also all the villains did for the show, which I appreciate. But nevertheless, Emma, you have a thought.
Yes. Okay. So just speaking of the good points of Korra, another one for me is Varric. I loved that he was probably the only self-aware character on the show, but I feel like he brought like a sense of lightness to the last seasons that was needed. I think that like season 1 tried to take itself too seriously, and the fact that they were using their bending skills to play like this boxing match kind of game, and that's what we focused on for most of season 1. I feel like with season 2, when things kind of got a little crazier with the spirit world, it was nice to have Varric there to kind of like voice some of the audience's thoughts. And so I felt like he was a great addition to the cast.
I want to say, I think this may be a hot take, but I think this Korra's ensemble, its collection of characters, is better than Airbenders. Because Airbenders had a lot of unique, interesting characters, right? But the thing is also about that show, much to its aid and much to its detriment, every episode has its own plot. So for the most part, you only get an interesting character for 1 episode, maybe 2, and maybe you get a payoff way later on, right?
Yeah.
As opposed to this show, right? Where you'll like sort of consistently see characters here and there, but it's not really like characters are set up early on for this payoff later. It's just like, no, these characters are a part of this world, and we're going to allow characters to breathe life into this world to make this world more interesting and to improve the relationships, the character relationships. And as opposed to like in Avatar, like this character is associated with this plot, right?
Yeah.
It's like, no, these characters are being introduced because they are associated with these people.
Yeah.
So something like small characters like Tenzin's kids and Tenzin's siblings,
I do
even
like Tenzin's
Pema,
kids.
right? Like basically
Whoa.
Tenzin's whole group. I adore each of those characters in their own way, and they somehow really find ways to be unique in their own style.
Yeah, I would definitely say that the ensemble of Korra is stronger. I think I just like the gang better in Avatar. So,
And I think that's such a fair thing.
yeah,
That's such a
so I
fair
think
thing.
that's my first thought whenever you're like, I think it has a stronger ensemble. But then whenever I think about it, I'm like, oh, wait, I'm just thinking about 3 characters, and those are the leads.
Yeah.
Also, Pema is voiced by Lisa Edelstein, who was a main character on House, which is one of
You mean
main
Kaya?
ones.
You're talking about Kaya.
I am?
Yes, Kaya is Tenzin's sister.
Yeah.
The waterbender.
Yeah.
Pema is Tenzin's wife.
You're correct.
That's a very big difference.
that
unless-
was
Kind of
needed.
awkward difference.
You know.
Yeah.
Quite.
But, yeah, no, so Lisa Edelstein is one of the main characters on...
And I recognize that voice
House.
immediately too.
Oh, yeah.
But and also, like, I think a lot of the vocal performances in this show are really strong. I'm surprised we didn't get to acting until this very moment.
Well, I was about to mention that, but right before we move on to that, I think another huge difference between Avatar and Legend of Korra is like we're talking about like how it's made for different age groups and everything. But something that goes along with that is that Avatar relied so much more on comedy, and they didn't really allow itself to be serious. So, for instance, there were a lot of characters that relied on the comedy. So if you did not find Sokka funny, you were not going to buy into Sokka whatsoever.
And so
Until the sword episode.
And so yes, and then when Sokka is serious, it's like, oh, finally, you know.
Right. You're like, okay, well, I'm kind of done with you already. Yeah. But yeah, okay, there's two things that I'm shocked we haven't talked about yet. Okay. Absolutely shocked we haven't talked about yet. I'm shocked that we haven't talked about the rip-off Ember Island Players episode.
Yes, okay, that's fair. We'll get there.
And specifically, the genius and unparalleled J.K. Simmons.
I love J.K. Simmons in the show.
Tenzin deserves more. Tenzin did not do enough.
If I gave a gold medal to someone in the show, it is Tenzin. He is so much fun.
Yes.
Every time Tenzin is on screen, he's great. He also grows as a character, which I love. And just I love the relationship between Korra and Tenzin and his family. It's just the funniest and the greatest thing. And J.K. Simmons' acting is superb for an animated show. Tenzin through and through is it's just so neat. I
definitely
love him.
Yeah, well, and I wish that they gave him more to do. Like, I wish he had more, even. Kind of like Jinora. I really enjoyed Jinora. And I get it that, like, they only have time for so much and they can only flesh out characters so much, but she was so cool.
I agree. I also disagree because even though, like, I was happy enough to get some progression for those characters, but I was also able to know, okay, the show is not about them, right? So I was like able to let it slide, but at the same time, I would still be like, why wasn't Tenzin in this episode? I wish Tenzin was in this episode, right? And Tenzin is in most of the episodes, but there were episodes that Tenzin wasn't in that I would think to myself, man, I wish Tenzin was here.
I was really shocked and impressed with how focused the show writers and the showrunners were able to keep the plot. Because there were a lot of times where you can tell that they did not necessarily like the story that was going on or like the episode they were writing, but they were like, oh, we have to stay focused to the story we chose. We have to keep true to the things that we've set up. And that was impressive.
I also want to say, I think the theming in this show, I don't want to say in the sort of message, right? But I lack the proper terms. But the what this show is going for emotionally is, to me, I thought was very strong. Where you see throughout the show a lot stories and relationships that have to do that encounter forgiveness. And I am a sucker for absolute sucker
for comeback story.
For not just comeback story, but like comeback like emotional story. Like not comeback like came from nothing and like rose, right? But I'm saying like emotionally, like forgiveness. And so you see it so much between Korra and Tenzin and his siblings, Tenzin's kids between each other, Lin Beifong and her sister, Toph and their children, Tonraq and Korra as well. It's Mako and Korra, Mako and Asami. Like, it's the whole thing. Mako and Bolin is another great example. There are so many times where characters are at wit's end with one another, but they find a way to join together in a very special moment. So, for example, in either the very last episode or the episode before last, when Asami and her father make up for that one last moment when they're in the bee-looking mech suit, and they puncture a hole into Kuvira's gigantic Gundam, essentially. But my heart was sore because for me, storytelling wise, like I love the fact that Asami was able to find in some way to forgive her father, to have that emotional payoff that started all the way in season 1, and then to like have her father sacrifice himself, so in a sense redeeming himself, and just like in that moment, like it's heart-wrenching, to to be able to like celebrate that love, and then all of a sudden that love is gone and not by one's volition per se. So I think in the emotional and dramatic storytelling and its theming in the show, it executes a such better job as opposed to Airbender, where you will occasionally get it, right? Like you got it in the Tales of Ba Sing Se episode where Iroh sets up a picnic for his deceased son, right?
Oh.
Or you get like Zuko just freaking out at his uncle occasionally here and there, right? Just in occasional episodes, right? But the story, like Max said, it is geared towards comedy. It's focused towards comedy. So what Korra tries to do is something completely different. And so I don't expect a lot of people to be necessarily on board with Korra, because Korra and Avatar, even though they're two shows set in the same universe with some of the same exact characters, they're two completely different shows that are tied together just because of the worlds that they're in, but not because of the stories they are trying to tell. Emma, do you have any final thoughts on The Legend of Korra and what you, deep down in your heart of hearts, actually think about this show?
Yeah, so I think that it would have aided me if I didn't love Avatar so much and then went into Legend of Korra thinking that it was a sequel, because I think, like you said, it's best to approach it as it's in the same world, but it's a completely different thing. And I think that it did get stronger as it went on. I think that seasons 3 and 4 were better than 1 and 2. But I just feel like initially, first episode, the letdown of it not being just another Avatar: The Last Airbender, which is what I wanted in that moment, got to me. And also the fact that Korra immediately was not someone that like I related to or that I thought was super cool. I was kind of like, she's annoying. And she was the main focus. But as they added the ensemble of characters, I definitely enjoyed it more. And I feel like you said, that's kind of where Korra shines. But yeah, I mean, as far as people watching it right after Avatar, I've said, like, go into it with an open mind. And also, like, maybe even take a break between the two so that you're not just going into it thinking that it's going to be the same thing. But it's worth the watch, especially now because it's on Netflix, so it's free.
Mac, what are your thoughts? Final thoughts.
Well, the very first thing that I want to get off my chest is so the episode where they tried to do the Ember Island players thing.
Oh, right. Oh,
where it was just them.
Look, it was a bad episode. I'm not gonna front. Okay,
as long as we can all agree that was cheap.
Really fast. There was essentially a recap episode, right? And that episode was cheap. This is not an excuse, but I did find out supposedly for some reason, I guess the money that they got to make the show in the 4th season was less than they were expecting / wanting. So they saved money by essentially, quote unquote, not doing an episode.
Whoa.
Yeah, but like that's not to excuse that episode.
Right.
That doesn't make that episode good, right? I'm like kind of okay with that episode because it didn't really mess with things narratively too much, as opposed to the Ember Island episode where in that season I'm like the pacing is getting messed up here and there, and so I'm so frustrated. Like, you wasted 23 minutes on recapping the whole show when you could have strengthened relationships between Zuko and the rest of the group when he's only been here for like 5 minutes. And then no, and listen to me. No, I'm still, listen, I enjoy Airbender, okay? But the thing that bothered me was because Zuko joins the group halfway into season 3, right? Like, we see this bleep coming in the first season, okay? We see it coming, okay? Then we get it halfway into season 3. And then, because they have so little time, each episode with Zuko is like, field trip with Zuko. Zuko and Aang, go meet dragons. Zuko and Sokka, prison break. Zuko and Katara, revenge. Zuko and Toph, we didn't have time for that episode. You know what? Let's write an episode about the group recapping the whole thing. And you know what? forget character relationship and growth progression with one another. Let's just, you know what? Next episode, let's have a 4-episode chronicle of the finale. Mac, what do you have to say?
Well, I don't think the audience realizes this, but you guys just signed up for another 30 minutes. There was a...
We'll be right back!
Are we really going to go to the break right now? You're kidding.
I don't have to be.
Do you actually want to go to break?
Emma, are you happy for another segment? Because I'm ready. Now I'm fueled to the fire.
Yes.
But this is more about, like, your hate for Avatar.
Yeah.
It's more... that's fair. I don't want to do that then.
Okay, so this is... Okay,
We were
this is all I'm
feeling
gonna say.
positive. It was all going to be okay, Danny. And then you just jumped off
we got
the
knocked
edge.
Because I was thinking about that one episode.
Yeah.
One episode in Avatar was like, why would you do this? There was never a
Honestly-
moment in Korra that I'm like, what the hell are you doing? You had such a good thing going, right?
Yeah.
That, like, I think maybe, like, the peaks of Korra were never reached the peaks of Avatar, right? But the dip that Avatar experienced was so low, like, Korra never had as low of a dip that Avatar had in that moment. Because it just felt so undeserved.
The thing that bothered me the most about the original the Avatar episode,
The Ember Island Players, yes.
is that in making that decision to do a recap episode, you are in a way telling the audience, okay, well, there's not really anything else we need to do that we really want to do.
Yes.
And it's like, okay, hold up. There's actually plenty you should be doing right now.
Yeah.
That isn't this episode.
Yeah.
So I do agree with that. There was a lot of things they could have done.
And I think, like,
They didn't.
even though that's a similar thing that happened in Korra, right? Where there could have been things, right? It was just there were so many problems leading up to the Ember Islands episode that was making me pull my hair out.
Yeah.
I didn't feel as many problems leading up to that episode
Right.
in Korra, that recap episode. It's still not a good episode. The lack of money does not excuse that episode. I understand why it happened, but that doesn't make it a good episode. So I am happy
Yeah.
that you brought that up. But nevertheless, aside from that
Yes.
one individual epised, even though it's important to acknowledge,
Yeah.
what were
Overall.
your total thoughts on Korra as a show, as an experience?
Yeah, I thought it was fine. I'll leave it there.
That's fair.
Yeah, I thought it was...
It's a different show.
You ranked it like a 5 out of 10 with me.
Yeah,
so
I
that's
rated it
very
a perfect
average.
5.
That's very
Yeah, I rated it
medium.
perfect. Because I think that there's no reason...
Because what
don't
it
think-
seems like is you wanted a different show, which is fine.
Kind of. But I think the main thing is this. If you've already seen Avatar, then go watch Legend of Korra. If you haven't seen Avatar, don't watch Legend of Korra. As well as, unless you're doing a podcast about it, I wouldn't go watch Avatar so that you can watch Legend of Korra.
I agree.
It's not that good.
And
But if you just want more Avatar-
and like we've all said, I do think they're both very individual experiences.
Yeah.
And I think if you like Avatar, I think you should at least give Korra a shot.
Yeah, well, and that was like the biggest and most important part of Avatar: Last Airbender was that they did like the best, like the primary job they did in making that show was they made a fantastic world that even if there was like there wasn't really important things going on, you're okay with just kind of fucking around in the world with these characters because it was such an interesting world they kept building.
As opposed to
Yeah.
more so in Korra, there are things that we need to get done now.
Right. So the feeling that you have after watching Avatar, where you're like, I kind of just want to like play around this world a bit more. Korra will do that enough.
Yeah.
Not a lot, but enough. And you?
I listen, I loved Korra.
Mm-hmm.
And I loved Avatar. And I loved those two shows for very different reasons. Because what I think Avatar tries to do, I think it does really well, and I think what Korra tries to do, it does really well. And I had a great time watching both series. And I can't help but recommend, I agree with Emma's notion 100% that once you finish Avatar, give yourself some time before watching Korra, because it is, Matt kind of alluded to it, but a sort of culture shock.
Yeah.
In terms of like the world it is thus created, but still using it the same foundation.
Right.
To its advantage and to its disadvantage, how it becomes a world that's very familiar but also very unfamiliar. You have a thought.
Denny, what are we watching next week?
Excellent question. So next week,
Or listening to, or whatever.
we are going to watch. I'm going to explain very briefly because we are going to look at a documentary, but it's not a documentary in the traditional sense. It's a documentary that purely just looks at numbers. And you might be wondering, that's a weird documentary.
You're kidding. You're lying.
So there is a documentary that has to do with, I kid you not, Bob's
No!
in sports.
I'm gonna cry, Danny.
Done by John Boyes and others of Sports Nation.
Oh my god, I'm so excited. Okay.
And that is what we will be observing and reviewing next week.
The Bob epidemic, correct?
The Bob
Pandemic?
Emergency. It's the Bob
Emergency.
Emergency.
Thank you.
I have forgotten the name for a second to say it. Yes, the Bob Emergency. 2 episodes, about 30 minutes each.
The genius John
The
Boyes.
genius John Boyes. Emma, thank you so much
Seriously, thank
for
you.
coming on this week. You have supplied impeccable conversation, and the both of us greatly appreciate your time. Thank you.
Well, thank you
You
for
rock.
having me.
All right, and thank you, Mac. And
Thank you, everyone.
and we'll see each other again.